up, my Good Vibe DJ tribe, and welcome to another episode of the DJ Spotlight here on Disc Jockey News TV. He is a Vancouver-based producer, performing artist, Abelton Certified Trainer that provides one-on-one tutoring for people interested in learning or improving on their production skills. Since 1995, this artist has been performing Techno Live all over North America in cities like Portland, Seattle, Chicago, Detroit, and Denver. Some of his earliest performances were at the now long-closed and legendary Zoot's Coffee House in Detroit's Cass Corridor. By 2012, he started up the Subspect Music imprint and focused most of his efforts in his J. Garrett project. His tracks have been played and charted by important artists throughout the techno industry. Since relocating to Vancouver in 2000, Josh has become a central figure in the local techno community, from both performing live and promoting events in collaboration. Josh, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's awesome.
It has been pretty incredible checking out all the different things that you've got going on. I'd love to hear about your early beginnings into the industry up until where you are today.
Okay. Well, it could be a really long story, but I'll try to make a concise version. So coming up through the scene in Ann Arbor, I got into sort of going into nightclubs and stuff because there was a teen night at one of the clubs there, which kind of introduced me to that world. And then in the early 90s, I started DJing when I went off to university. At that time, it was mostly industrial and post-punk and alternative stuff. And then I was aware of house music, but it hadn't really, I guess, hit me the same way yet. In 92, I moved back to Michigan from Massachusetts, where I was going to school, and got sort of more introduced directly into the techno scene in Detroit, and started going to underground parties and stuff, and sort of introduced through Underground Resistance and Plus 8. And then in 94, there was a guy who moved to Ann Arbor from Vienna, and he and another guy were starting a label, and they wanted somebody who kind of could build a brand. And I had been doing a t-shirt line called Smiley, which the logo was a radiation symbol made into a smiley face. And that was around Detroit and the Midwest for a while, between like 93 to 95. So they asked me to kind of come in on that, and that's sort of how I came in on to the back end of it, not just being a party kid, but being involved with labels and stuff like that. So as far as making music, I've been doing that in bands since about junior high. And I was always into synthesizers and stuff. So I had like a DX7 and various little rhythm boxes and things. And so around 94, 95, I started putting my studio together, mostly outboard stuff. And then I kind of fell out of DJing actually for a bit, but kind of got back into it. There was just so many, Ann Arbor and Detroit at the time, there were just so many people doing things. The competition was really heavy, and I was like, okay, well, I can concentrate more on my live thing because there's already so many, amazing DJs to try to compete with. So, but then I've been involved with labels throughout the time. I don't think there's been a time where I haven't been involved with one in one way or another, whether I'm running it or releasing on it. I've had a net label called Synthetic that I ran from 2006 until about 2010. And then the idea for Subspec came about when I was in Detroit with my buddy Rob, and we both were realizing that we missed running labels after we had both shut our imprints down. And so we started putting the groundwork together for that, and launched in 2012. And then we started doing some events in Vancouver under the name, and the combination of the events and the label really, put some momentum behind everything. And these days I've got a PR firm that I'm working with in Berlin that's really good at getting tracks in front of people. And I'm trying out a few other things and working on, they mostly run sort of my social media and some of the back-end label stuff.
Wow. Wow, so much stuff.
It's handy. So yeah, I guess I don't know. So yeah, so that's kind of that. I think also what happened with Subspec is I'm getting a little older, realizing that my time to really achieve stuff is starting to get a little thinner. So I was like, okay, I got to do something, and that's kind of what kind of kicked that up a bit. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that totally does. There was a few things that you mentioned about how like it was so busy in your industry. So it's like, okay, do I keep DJing or do maybe I go analog? Do I start doing these live performances? I really love that you recognize that and took a hold of that, especially somebody that already has that experience. You talked a little bit about how Subspec came along. How have you seen that project grow over time?
Well, when we launched it, it was the idea was very different. So Rob Galbraith was my partner at the time, and our idea was that was going to be fairly wide musically, and so it was really just something where we wanted to be able to put our own stuff out and work with people who we wanted to work with that fairly low pressure, and the demo process is a bit of a drag. And so this way we could make what we wanted to make, and we could put out stuff by, we have a lot of very sort of talented friends in our pool. And so we wanted to put stuff out that we supported. And so the original idea, and you can kind of see this in the first two releases, was a much wider style of electronic music. So it would have probably been a bit of industrial, some IDM. But what ended up happening is that Rob got a new job just after we started, and so the catalog started getting put together by me. Instead of, so the very first release is Somatic Responses, which is they're a pair of brothers from Wales who make just fantastic music, but borders on industrial noise stuff. But they also have like some techno elements and electro and stuff in there. And so their first EP really reflected that. There was electro on it, there's techno on it, there's like noisy industrial on it. And then the second EP, which was released actually on the same date, was one by me, which is pretty much straight techno. And so as Rob got busy and he wasn't bringing releases in, and I started to bring them in, the first year pretty much solidified around techno. So we had a couple EPs by me, we had an EP by Sohn from Seattle, Terrence Dixon did an EP on the first year. Simplex from Toronto, who used to do stuff on like Steel City of Hamilton and Stickman. I think actually when Stickman he released with Jason Justin, but same guy. And so yeah, so what ended up happening is Rob realized that he was just too busy to really be involved. And a few years later, or maybe even within the year, he relaunched his component imprint, which is more focused on sort of left field and industrial stuff. So I ended up kind of running Subspec from that point on, and yeah. So we've grown. We've released by some stuff by some really big names. We've had stuff. We've had remixes from like Drum Cell, for example. We've had an EP from Woody McBride. We've got remixes from Brendan Muller. We've been a launching pad for like Rustle out of, or Rustle, he says it's okay however you say his name, out of Dublin. And so I think his first EP was with us, and then he's gone on to release with like Gynoid and a bunch of other high profile labels, and up here at Trezor and stuff like that. And he's doing really well. And we've got stuff from like, Rennie Foster and stuff. So, keeping some of it fairly local. But I'd say that most of our support has actually, we have a fair bit in North America, but most of it's coming from Europe. So most of our sales go into, Germany, the UK, France, stuff like that. So
that's super rad, though. You took something locally. You're like, hey, let's take control of the situation and do our own label. And now it's like the bigger picture where all that music is so incredibly popular. That's where you're getting the notice. That's amazing. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks.
What some people might not know about you is about how you are Abelton Certified Trainer, providing these one-on-one lessons. What has that experience been like for you? And maybe tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
Okay. So I had applied for, let me back up a little bit. So when I first started getting involved with music production, really around 95, started to take it more seriously after sort of building my studio through a few years before that. There was one guy in particular in Ann Arbor who was really supportive of what I was doing. And his philosophy was that everybody should make their own music or have the opportunity to make their own music. And so I kind of, from his support of me with that attitude, I kind of came to bring that into part of my philosophy that, everybody should have the opportunity. And so helping people figure out how to do what they're doing or, express themselves in music or something is something that I'm really interested in doing. And so also in about 2010, there was a bunch of stuff happening at my day job, and I thought that I should maybe start looking for some alternatives. And one of the things I thought about was going into music education and helping people, learn Ableton, which I'd been using since version 3 in 2004, something like that. Anyway, and so I had submitted an application for the Abelton Certified Trainer program, and they got back to me and asked if I was interested in participating in one of their training events, and decided to go ahead and do that. And so in 2011, I got my certification for Ableton 8, Live 8. And really what I focus on is one-on-one tutoring. Occasionally I'll do presentations to larger groups, but I don't have like a formal syllabus or anything that I'm working through in terms of a course. So really what I focus on is trying to understand what people are trying to get out of it, and then working with them to sort of build that up. Sometimes I get asked to come in and help them figure out synthesizers, which are not Ableton related, but there's a lot of the same underlying stuff. Like if you understand like a ADSR envelope, well then you know how it works in software and you know how it works in a synthesizer. So anyway, but a lot of the time what will happen is I'll have someone who just needs sort of like a little bit of a push or a little extra assistance. And so I'll meet with them for a couple hours and we'll work through, and maybe I'll hear from them again, maybe not, maybe they've gotten what they needed to get to the next level, whatever it is they're doing. Some people, I have, I meet with repeatedly, and but it's fairly informal, basically just helping them get some of the concepts and what it is that the software can do, because everybody I know who uses Live uses it slightly differently. And so it's about figuring out what works for that person and what part of the set of tools is going to get them where they want to get to.
That's so incredibly helpful because, a lot of us, we go online and try to look up these tutorials, or we, go on the forums or just try to figure it out ourselves. And it can be really frustrating, and have that one-on-one, somebody sitting right there with you. It's like, how do you do this? Click, click, click. Mm-hmm. Oh my God, that was all right. Thank you. Is there any one thing that really stands out to you as far as which artists tend to do better in your sessions? Maybe they have some it factor that helps them progress more quickly or farther than others.
I think it really comes down to a desire to learn it and a passion for it more than anything else, as opposed to like, there are some technical things, obviously. If you have a certain understanding of music, if you understand time signatures and how to count to 8, for example, especially if there's someone who is a DJ who's transitioning into production, the DJ understanding of music is not always the same as a producer's understanding of music. And I've met people who can loop things, but they don't necessarily know where the 1 is, for example, right? So that can be a challenge, which I'm actually kind of surprised about, because typically as a DJ, you're working on 32s, which, is 4 groups of 8. So, you should know where those 1s are falling. But sometimes they just don't have that practical foundation. But once they sort of get past that, yeah. So understanding musical phrases and how to count them. So I've had, and some of it may actually be styles of music, right? Because if you're doing house music or techno, those 32s are pretty standard. I found when I'm working with trance DJs, that format's even more sort of standardized. So it's a very different approach if you're working with something that's sort of like, rare groove or disco, where or post-punk or whatever, where it's sort of like the changes happen where the changes happen, as opposed to that there's something that's going to happen every 32 beats or whatever. Sorry.
Oh no, I think that's really interesting that you mentioned that, because sometimes I've worked with or have gotten music off of people that produce music, but they don't DJ. And you can tell the way they produce it, it is not friendly for DJs. Still wonderful tracks, but not necessarily always disc jockey friendly. But I was surprised to learn that a lot of these DJs were having trouble with time signatures. I know that for me, with like a history of dancing and DJing, I never really knew what beat, bar, phrase. I just felt the music and went for it. So when I started working on music and my production program, it was like, yeah, no big deal. So it's really interesting to hear about your experiences with DJs. I was going to ask you, has there been any like really surprising lessons that you've learned in this industry? Maybe something you wouldn't have learned unless you made the mistake or tried something new out?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me is that there's no end destination, right? I work with and know people who are all along the road at different levels, musically and in terms of what they've achieved and accomplished. And I think the biggest thing is to sort of set goals for yourself and figure out how to get to whatever it is that you're going for next. And it's tough because I think sometimes people think that there's a finish line for the climb. And I've met plenty of artists who are way more established than I am, who, they're facing the same struggles and they're doing the same things and they're having to make the same decisions. And some of them have machines around them. So they've got, full organizations that are really, running everything for them or on their behalf. And some of them are doing it all on their own. But, a lot of times they're making the same sort of decisions about how they do things. And a lot of labels have very different approaches to, how they release and what they do. I mean, that's one of the things that, like with Subspec, for example, when we have a new release coming out, we don't really promo it until it's out. And part of that is that we don't have the clout that people are really looking for our next release, I think, for the most part. Right now, we've been on a very aggressive schedule, I guess, for the last 3 years of releasing every 3 to 4 weeks. And that's a lot of music. And what we do is when it comes out, that's when we promo it. So that way, as soon as it's charted or it appears in a mix, people can go to whichever store they want to buy from and purchase and download that track. And we also have a Bandcamp, but there's other labels where, I just recently had a track come out on Perk Tracks, and with Perk Tracks, I mean, it's one of the labels that people are really watching. And so they're really looking for that next thing, even though it may be, a couple months in between releases. And with Perk Tracks, Perk is able to build up anticipation and stuff with it. And what was interesting with the compilation was that it came out sort of quietly on 12-inch, which I'm not actually on the 12-inch. I'm on the digital version. I'm the one bonus track on the digital version, which is still awesome. But when the 12-inch came out, it just kind of dropped into stores, and there wasn't a lot of hype around it from Perk's social media or any of that. And so it was out there, and people just kind of started to find it. And then a week later, the digital version came out, And same thing. It was just like people found it because it was a perk release or perk tracks release that was now showing up in stores, but there wasn't like a big ad campaign or anything about it. But there was a DJ service campaign that ran for several weeks before it was released. So DJs knew about it coming, and they were receiving it, and they could start to put it into their mixes. And so when it started showing up in mixes and stuff, then people are anticipating it. So whereas, our approach is quite different, but we're at a completely different level of attention than perk tracks. So
I think it's really fantastic that you understand and appreciate that. Like, that this is your label, this is the way things are running, this is what works for you guys, and what somebody else does, fantastic. Do what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've had quite a bit of experience traveling. What are your must-haves, needs, and habits in traveling? Maybe something other people out there should know about.
Well, I've got a number of friends who do way more than I do, but I do get out there a bit. I'm 6'4", so being on airplanes is tough. So if you can get upgrades, those are great. Get some extra room. But for me, I think really, and I mean, this may come as sort of general knowledge for a lot of people, but making sure you're drinking water and getting sleep, those are two of the most important things. And of course, with what we're involved with, sometimes it's treated as just a continuous party. And I think it's important sometimes to step back from that, because that if you try to keep that pace up and you're drinking more alcohol than water, for example, then you're going to end up paying for it. And it happens. I mean, I know that I've been to plenty of after parties, after shows and stuff. So the temptation's there. But I think sleep and water is important. Traveling light. I mean, it's way easier these days for DJs playing with CDJs. You just throw a couple of USB sticks in your luggage as opposed to dragging a record box around. In my case, mostly playing live these days. Occasionally, still DJing. I'm carrying a laptop and controller and stuff, so I've got a gig bag, but I've got it all down to where it's in one shoulder bag, basically. So
carry on.
Exactly. Yeah, I made the mistake back in 2013. I was playing one of the after parties in Movement in Detroit, and I had a rolling bag that had all my gear in it, and it was too big to carry on, so they made me check it. And I pulled my laptop out, but not the rest of it, and it got delayed. And it was a real mess trying to get that back from them, and seeing how loose they treated the whole thing from the hairline. But anyway, I ended up getting it back. Lucky circumstance, but that's a story for another time. But definitely try to carry on as much as you can and drink water.
Yes, I actually just did an out-of-town gig this weekend. It was a corporate gig, so it was like 6 hours one day, 6 hours the next. And the city I was in had a bunch of friends, and they're like, "Do you want to come out?" And I'm like, "I do, but..." And I'm so glad. I was like, "I'm just gonna have a disco nap." Woke up at 6 a.m. the next morning.
Oh wow!
I was like, "Okay, my body needed the sleep. I'm glad I gave it what it needed." But yeah, that's so important. And actually, the DJ Dingo that we interviewed last week, he's a CrossFit trainer. He does like special events for like sporting events, and he said much of the same of that sleep and the eating well and the staying hydrated. And then of course we get into the junk sometimes.
Oh yeah, it's easy to slip into it, but yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Are there any upcoming exciting things that you've got going on? Maybe some new tunes, any projects you want to share with us to end off this video?
Sure. So I've got an EP coming out in, I guess, November 5th with Gobsmacked out of Berlin. It's a formal, I guess they were in Dublin in Ireland when they started. These days they're running in Berlin, which is, sort of the place to be for what we're doing. And so really looking forward to that. Been getting some really good feedback on those tracks. And So also doing some media campaign around that too. So we'll see what happens.
Right on. Oh, that's so fantastic. I'm so happy for you. I'm so glad
Fun.
that you got in touch with me. Wishing you lots of success on the upcoming EP, and maybe we will DJ together in the near future.
Oh, that'd be wicked. Well, thanks so much for having me on. It was
Yes.
fun talking.
Thank you.